You're about to watch a video about a TTRPG you've never played and have not read a single word about, besides some meme about how crunchy it is, solely because you're on some hunch that it will elevate your table's game. Do you even need a catchy intro? I was where you are in this exact moment a few years ago. You've had your time playing the quote-unquote default TTRPG, but you've since gotten bored of that, whether it be through overexposure or through a dislike of the core mechanics. Don't get me wrong, I love your average XP grinding looting dungeon crawl, but I found that some rule sets tend to be better suited for video games rather than TTRPGs.
And the game of the year is Baldur's Gate 3.
But that's just me. If the thought of a modular rule set that you can put together to meet your specific needs makes you queasy, this probably isn't the game for you. But if you revel in the challenge and hunger for your unique world to be made in TTRPG form, by all means, go and read GURPS Basic. I'm serious. Do it right now. Click off the video, pull out your legal copy of GURPS Basic, and read it. You're back, and slightly frustrated,
Come on!
I can tell. As much as I love this game and its mechanics, its core rulebook is messy. That's because it's not really meant to be read all at once, or in order for that matter. You need to see GURPS Basic as less of a step-by-step guide, and more as an almanac where you can flip anywhere and find a ruling on nearly anything. Different people are going to need different things from GURPS Basic, and as such, will need to take their own path through the book. So, how do you start? By learning how to build a character. Yes, even you, Forever GM. Going through character building not only helps you guide your players, but through first-hand experience, you'll understand the building blocks of this system and what makes it tick. Learning how fragile and how strong characters can be is central to balancing your games. But first, let's get into some of the basic conventions of GURPS as a whole, so you can understand the rules that come up from them. If you know TTRPGs, you know at least somewhere there's dice involved. GURPS is no exception, but the way it's done may be different than what you're familiar with. GURPS is what's considered a 3d6 roll-under system. What does that mean? Allow me to give you an example. Let's say I'm prompted to make a roll in something where my attribute is 11. I roll 3 6-sided dice and get a 10 in return. I succeeded on my roll, because in GURPS, rolling equal to or under your attribute means success. This fact may be difficult to get used to. If you've played games where rolling higher yielded you better results, then it probably feels weird hoping to roll an 8, but believe me, this rolling system leads to way more satisfying gameplay when it comes to performing critical actions. Gone are the days where you can be an absolute pro at hacking at enemies while worrying about the 5% of attacks that critically fail for no reason whatsoever. However, that's not to say that criticals don't happen. Take a look at this handy chart. If you dozed off during stats class, you may instead recognize it from one of the many Wojak slop memes on Twitter. A critical success occurs whenever you roll a natural 3 or a natural 4, and this threshold can actually increase depending on how high your attribute is. As for the opposite, those values typically stay the same. Rolling a 17 or an 18 always results in a critical failure, which again change depending on how high or how low your skill is. See this bump here though? Because you're rolling multiple dice, your results tend to resonate around the average, which is approximately 10. You're only ever going to have a minuscule percent of rolls resulting in crits, both keeping those moments exceptional and placing a greater emphasis on how you build your characters and how you act during play. So then what's the point of increasing an attribute past 18 if that's the highest you can roll? Another convention of GURPS is that difficulty is shown by penalizing or even boosting your attributes depending on the situation, the sum of that being called your effective skill. Your environment and your choice of moves can all influence your chances in many ways. So characters that push beyond 18 skill can routinely make riskier and riskier maneuvers, which encapsulates a lot of high-level play. The same goes for characters with a low-level skill. They're not just doomed to fail, they'll just have to take their time or utilize mechanics that boost their desired attributes. So that's how success rolls work, but what about the other stuff? What other dice does GURPS use? Well, it's only 6-sided dice from here on out, so break into your Monopoly or Yahtzee set and get those d6s ready. Since it's all 6-sided dice, GURPS just abbreviates it to D, so whenever you see something like 2D or 4D in the book, you'll know what dice it's talking about. You mainly see that being used for damage rolls or other random effects. I'll get more into damage later on, but keep that in mind. Let's go back to skill rolls though, as there's another rolling convention you need to know called the Quick Contest. You'll see this be referenced often throughout the book. This framework is tied to combat, social, and even supernatural aspects of the game, so it makes sense why. Here's how it works. When a quick contest is prompted, it's done between two opposing characters. They each roll against their listed skill, and whoever succeeds wins the contest. What happens if both parties succeed? At that point, it goes to whoever's margin of success is higher. If both parties instead fail, it's up to their margin of failure. Those who better cater their build are going to be at an advantage. However, there are a few rules in place that prevent overtuned characters from shit-stomping weak NPCs in quick contests. Now let's get on to the last rolling type of GURPS, the reaction roll. The reaction roll, and by extension the reaction table, can get kind of controversial, and deserve its own section entirely in the video, so I'll only get into how you roll it for now. Pretty much, you still use 3d6, but instead the higher you roll the better. There's no skill you're rolling against, you just use the table and any bonuses or penalties you have. There's no criticals involved either. So there you are, you now know what the 3 main types of rolling are in GURPS. Are you ready to play now?
Absolutely fucking not.
You do see how long this video is, right? This is not your average TTRPG after all. We need to hash out some more of the terms and gameplay expectations you'll need to get used to before we dig right in. While Basic by itself is the core rulebook and gives you everything you need as far as starting a game, you might have noticed that there are a lot more books that GURPS has in its library. These are colloquially called modules and can range from anything to detailed rules about specific time periods, different magic systems, or even complete gameplay overhauls. I guarantee you there's something for everybody.
My shit, okay. Yeah. And then, oh fuck!
A GM will typically tell you up front what modules they're using, and the stuff that's included or ruled out for their setting. GURPS has more of an emphasis on GM control when it comes to starting campaigns, since at the end of the day, it's their world and things may differ depending on what their personal views are on mechanics to fit their genre. This idea of the GM picking and choosing rules may seem a little despotic for some.
Yeah, I buy him.
But believe me, if you let new players use everything Basic gave you, it would be a complete disaster. Your gritty, realistic zombies game wouldn't really hit if one of your players could just levitate in the air, right? So while Basic is a large book, you may only be using a small slice of it initially. The next thing we need to talk about is the given power level of a campaign. GURPS doesn't use mechanics like levels and experience points for a sense of vertical progression along a single path. It uses character points, allowing players horizontal progression to pick any trait they please, within the rules of the game and the discretion of the GM, of course. Each quantifiable character trait has a given point value, whether it be physical, mental, or supernatural. If you have enough points to take a given trait, you can add it to your sheet. When you begin a game, the GM will tell you how many points you can start out with. They may even allot points meant solely for supernatural abilities or social skills. As far as character progression goes, the GM should be rewarding their players anywhere from 0 to 5 points per session, depending on how they did. When spending those points, you may need an in-game justification to explain why you picked up such a trait. Always be sure to ask your GM for the go-ahead. It may be odd to explain why a mixed martial artist with no college education suddenly picked up a high-level understanding of theoretical physics. If you've looked at some of the traits on a character sheet, you may notice some with a negative point value instead of a positive one. Those are called disadvantages, and they actually give you extra points to spend. I'll get into those later on, but the GM also has a say on how many points you can gain from disadvantages as well. When you put all of these parameters together, you form the foundation of a campaign. So if someone tells you they're running a modern supernatural game that uses high-tech, horror, and action with a set character point limit of 150 with 50 disadvantages, and a skill limit of 16, you'll be able to get a feel for what that game may be like. Now that you know the core rolling mechanics and the basic descriptors of a game to either join or run, let's get into the real meat of it, making your character. If you haven't looked at a GURPS character sheet before, seeing it for the first time may feel like you're filling out a W-2 form. But who actually does taxes anyway, am I right? Just ignore them, they'll eventually go away. Like Basic, let's piece this up into smaller chunks, rather than looking at the entire thing. The first part of the book does this too. By going through each individual rectangle of the sheet, the majority of its length comes from the sheer amount of traits a player can pick up. As much as I love telling you guys to skim over the book for this reason, the initial section marked in red is one of those parts you should read all the way through. That's because it goes over the top 2 sections on your character sheet, which covers the core stat line and social standing of a character. You can say that the other sections are also important, sure, but this section tends to be more dense with necessary information that other parts of the book later on directly reference. So let's start off with a character's basic attributes. Looking at all of your stats, you'll find that they're set at 10 by default. They each have a point cost you can spend to improve or lower them. Just know that lowering a stat does count towards your disadvantage limit, despite not actually being a disadvantage. These are the building blocks of your character's various traits and abilities. So while GURPS generally trends towards more specialized characters, it's still a good idea to have a solid stat line. Just don't go too overboard, or you'll be just an incredibly talented person with no life skills or defining traits whatsoever. The first stat we'll get into is strength, which is pretty self-explanatory. Strength covers most of the things you'd expect, with a few exceptions. It's got your typical stuff, like how much you can carry and lift, but strength also increases your hit points. It may seem strange, but that's because strength also measures your physical bulk. There's actually a size chart to determine how heavy or tall someone should be depending on their strength score, but that's largely used for less cinematic games. Strength is also the only stat that directly increases your damage dice when using melee or muscle-powered ranged weapons. Speaking of damage, let me show you the damage table. This is a scale that shows you how much damage you deal, depending on your strength score. You simply look for your strength score and use the corresponding dice. The only reason why it's as long as it is because it covers all types of characters. Some of these levels may be out of reach for players, but you never know what a campaign's NPCs are capable of. To increase your strength score, it costs 10 points per level. So if I wanted my strength to be 15, it would set me back 50 points. Now let's move on to dexterity. You've probably played a game that involves these course stats of some kind, so its description is pretty par for the course. Dexterity is a measure of one's physical coordination. A character who focuses this stat is able to pick up maneuvers on the fly with less skill points invested. This is because almost every physical skill and technique uses dexterity, and you'll learn there's a whole lot of skills in this game that you can pick up, which all become easier by investing in it. Dexterity also factors into your basic speed and your basic move, which both trickle down in their own ways, making this a very potent stat. However, for that reason, dexterity costs 20 points per level rather than 10. Not all stats are created equal. Speaking of which, let's move on to intelligence.
If you're wondering, I already know, and if you thought it, I've been new. What's going on, y'all?
This is a representation of a character's overall wit, and like dexterity, plays a part in a large portion of skills, covering both information and social skills. That's right, there's no core charisma stat in GURPS. Your influence skills mainly stem from intelligence. That's probably a head scratcher, but it's not meant to represent education, but craftiness instead. And either way, there's a trait you can take which fills in the role of charisma, so it's not like the game disregards it as a concept. Getting back into intelligence, it also directly affects your character's will and perception scores. So with all these factors in mind, it makes sense why it costs 20 points per level, like with dexterity. And last but not least of the primary attributes, we have health.
Oh, fuck, it's the chicken visual.
This is your general vitality and your ability to repeatedly bounce back from harm. You could have high HP to soak damage, but what's going to keep you alive in the long run is your health score. This is because health is what you'll be rolling against when dealing with pain, unconsciousness, or even death. In a combat-heavy game, characters with unimproved health scores are going to be tempting fate. Health also directly correlates to your fatigue points, and factors into your basic speed and basic move like dexterity does. Because of how necessary health is, it's a blessing that it only costs 10 points per level. These are the 4 primary attributes. Now let's take a look at the secondaries. From what we learned before, you saw how they stem from the primary attributes. You are able to independently increase them. However, depending on your game, you may only be allowed to do so to a certain extent. This is because in realism games, it only makes sense to boost your secondary attributes to a certain amount past your primary ones. You can see this as either a balancing choice or a setting choice, but most cinematic or fantasy games waive these limitations. Now let's get into our first secondary stat, hit points. The way hit points work in GURPS is a little bit different than other systems, so I'll give you a bit of a crash course. Like with most games, when you sustain damage, you subtract the final amount from your total hit points. There are a few twists with the way it's done, though. First off, there's more ways to incapacitate someone than just bringing their total HP to 0. If you're dealt damage equal to more than half of your HP in a single blow, you sustain what's called a major wound. After that happens, you must roll against your health score. If you fail, you suffer the effects of what's called knockdown. Under this effect, you fall prone and are stunned. You can only try to snap out of it on a subsequent health roll each turn afterwards. If you failed on your initial health roll by 5, you straight up lose consciousness. There's other ways you can take a major wound rather than just raw damage, but this info is just pertaining to your HP pool. The second caveat is how death is covered. You see, having your HP reduced to 0 is not a direct death sentence. In fact, certain characters can actually sustain themselves at 0 hit points for quite a while. There's actually a couple tiers of healthiness for characters that range from doing fine to being completely crushed into a pulp. If you're hurt, you've been bruised, cut, burnt, zapped, poisoned, or anything else. If you've got less than 1/3 of your HP, you're not going to be doing so hot. Both your move and your dodge become halved, and I'll get into both of those attributes down the line. Let's just say you become very vulnerable. At 0 hit points and below, things get even worse. Once you're brought to this level, you must make an immediate health roll. On a fail, you fall unconscious. At least at that tier, the worst that can happen is that you only pass out. If you're at negative hit points equal to your total HP, however, you're at immediate risk of death. Once you reach this tier, you must roll another health roll. Failing this one by more than 2 means you die. Thankfully, this risk isn't as frequent as passing out, only occurring once every multiple of HP you lose. Once you're at -5 times your HP though, that all changes. No matter what, at that point, you're dead. This may seem like an impossible HP level to reach, until you see the wounding modifiers for hit locations and how many dice of damage firearms deal. We could stop there, but at -10 times HP, any semblance of a body is destroyed. As a GM, get creative with just how demolished this player character or enemy is.
Stop! He's already dead!
Those are the levels of damage a character can take. Remember, these effects are all cumulative. Is it any wonder why HP only costs 2 points per level? Next, let's move on to Will. Thankfully, Will is a bit simpler. HP is kind of a doozy at first. This measures your mental fortitude and ability to ward off coercion or fear. Will is sort of the black sheep of all of the stats, because there may be some games where some characters never roll against it, let alone skills based on it. However, in other games, you may see it be used often, whether it be a resistance roll against spells or a spellcasting modifier itself. Before making it a quote-unquote dump stat, make sure you know what you're going up against. Will is going to cost 5 points per level. Next, let's move on to Perception. Now this one is going to be rolled a lot, whether it be your character investigating or your GM making passive sense rolls for you. Despite Perception being one stat, it's actually split up into 3 different subsets: vision, hearing, and taste or smell. The 3 can fluctuate depending on the situation or your character's build. Just because it's dark out, that doesn't mean you're suddenly worse at hearing. Like Will, Perception costs 5 points per level. Now we have fatigue points to go over. Fatigue points are a lot like hit points in that they can be depleted, but this time through exhaustion, casting spells, or even certain types of attacks. There's actually a scale similar to HP that shows the effects you suffer from various levels of fatigue, which I'll save for the next video. Just know for now that being below 0 means risking going unconscious or even losing hit points. Fatigue points cost 3 points per level. Next, let's move on to the rest of the secondary attributes: basic lift, basic speed, and basic move. The reason why I clump these up together is because personally I see them more as tertiary attributes rather than secondaries, as they're more passive and are based on an equation rather than directly on the primary attributes themselves. Basic lift is based off of strength, and basic speed and move are based off of dexterity and health. Basic lift deals with your character's encumbrance, but also how much they're able to physically lift without exerting themselves too much. Depending on the type of lift and how long you take can actually multiply the maximum weight. Your basic speed determines how fast you are, but by itself represents your reflexes. In combat, you move in order of how high your speed is. Basic move is just how far you can move in yards in one turn when making the move maneuver. Each of these attributes have their own costs to increase them individually as well, at varying point levels. That should be all, right? Well, there's one more thing I want to mention in this section, and that's a character's size modifier. You see, you can also control how big a character is beyond just the height of an average person. You can be the size of an apple or as tall as a building if you'd like, so long as the GM is okay with it. There's actually no direct point cost associated with your size modifier. Only incidental game rules like the modified cost of strength and becoming easier or harder to hit. Alright, we're finally finished with the first part of a character sheet. Let's move on to their appearance and social standing. As we've went over before, a GURPS character sheet starts out as a blank slate. You're a sculptor and you chisel out the details as you wish. The reason why I'm saying this again is because this section of the book tends to contain the more subjective parts of your character that some people don't really touch when drafting someone up. While there are a few tangible parts, like your physical means and how you look, a lot of it also goes into where you fit in society and how others see you.
My lord. Low-born girls say my lord, not my lord.
They only really matter if you want them to be a part of your gameplay. I know this may sound obvious. Why would you take a trait if you didn't expect it to be used? But it's mainly because some of it boils down to circumstance, like language, culture, and ideals. Anyway, back to the rules. The first thing I want to get into is your character's language. You see, language is split up between 2 different parts: speaking and writing. There are also levels of proficiency you can choose in a given language, ranging from broken to accented to native. You can also purchase a language at different speaking and writing levels at half cost. This comes in handy if you're playing a British character.
Majesty the King!
About my head.
Moving on from language, the section also goes over concepts like your appearance, your status, and your reputation, all of which service your reaction score. Speaking of which, it's about time I got into the table now. So, if you heard me mention the table and thought that GURPS players are too socially awkward to deal with personal interactions, they made a table to replace them. You may not entirely be off base, but it's not what the reaction table is for. The table only ever really needs to be rolled in times where the players are in a potential combat situation, are requesting for aid, or are requesting for information. Of course, there may be times where NPCs first meeting players deserve a roll to see how things go. There's a number of circumstances that can modify or even force certain reactions, but what we're getting into here is how a player's build can modify the table itself. The cost of those traits depend on how many people or situations they apply to. Your appearance shows how other people see you, to the extent that your looks can influence their opinions on you. These can range from looking like a monster to being unbelievably gorgeous. Your status is where you stand in society's hierarchy. Having an increased status means your character is entitled to more amenities and respect than your average person. Your reputation shows your history in a given group or culture, and varies in cost depending on how many people view you in a certain way. Adding these stats together, along with any other traits that boost or penalize your reaction modifier, are what you'll use to determine those roles. Now that you've established your character's core stats and some of their ties to the world, we can get into their unique abilities. For how many advantages there are and how much of the book they take up. To be honest, there's not much to go over here. They pretty much explain themselves. The rules for what they do are right there. You get what you pay for with your points. Of course, it's always at the GM's discretion, but how do you classify all these traits? If only they had some sort of symbol at all. Well, look at this. Okay, enough playing coy. The book has some signifiers of an ability source, those being mental, physical, social, exotic, and supernatural. They're not end-all be-all, as a mundane advantage could be given a supernatural explanation, or vice versa, given the circumstances. But they do serve as a good tell for if the ability could work for your game or for your character. If you're in a realism game, you can steer clear of the alien and the lightning bolt. That should be it for picking the advantages themselves, but what about modifying them? You may have seen some of these on some descriptions of specific advantages, but GURPS has a whole bunch of options to morph and change your abilities through modifiers and limitations. These let you either discount an advantage's point cost by adding a drawback to it, or making it more powerful but more expensive. Do you want to get a burst of power from being injected with Mountain Dew? Take Trigger. Do you want your innate attack to explode? Add some explosions to it. Your only hard limit is that you can't discount or expand your advantages by more than 80%. Now that you've got some of your character's cool toys, it's time to move on to their flaws. This is one of my favorite parts of the game, because adding disadvantages is what really allows your character to grow into their own. And the name itself is somewhat of a misnomer, because not all of them are necessarily bad traits. For instance, having a family to take care of is a disadvantage. Being honest is a disadvantage. Feeling responsible to protect humanity, also a disadvantage. The key thing to understand is that disadvantages are not negative, but traits that limit your character's playstyle. If you take a disadvantage, you better roleplay as if you have it, or else you shouldn't get the points you gained from it. Speaking of gaining points, if you decide to develop your character in-game and want to use the points you've earned throughout the campaign to buy them off, you can do so. Just make sure it makes sense. You can't just regrow a missing eye that you started out with. Another factor of disadvantages you should know is the self-control roll. You may see some disadvantages with an asterisk next to them. This means that their effect is based on a self-control roll, which by default is set at 12. Similar to modifiers with advantages, you can change this self-control roll for a discounted or increased disadvantage cost. While disadvantages can be great, make sure to watch out for players looking to incentivize their problematic gaming habits during a campaign. There are a few disadvantages that the book directly tells you not to pick if you're a character, and for good reason. So don't use some text meant for NPC enemies as an excuse to ruin someone's game. Alright, you're finally ready. It's time for you to give your character some skills. Like with advantages and disadvantages, there are a lot of skills in this game. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I will tell you how to buy them and how you should go about picking them. The way you buy skills is by taking a look at the skill cost table. I know, another table. This one is initially a head scratcher, but once you know how it works, it's pretty damn easy. You see, each skill is going to have a given difficulty, shown right under their name. You can't miss it. Since we're purchasing levels of climbing, we're going to be using the average column. And right next to its difficulty, we can see the attribute it's based on. Let's say we have a dexterity of 11. If I wanted to have a climbing skill of 13, I'd need to spend 8 points. See, that wasn't too bad now, was it? Now that you know how to buy a skill, let's look at the anatomy of a skill itself. As we saw before, skills are going to have a base attribute and a difficulty. This attribute doesn't necessarily have to be a primary stat. You'll see some secondaries as well. If you look below the skill's name, you'll see its default. This is what you roll against if you don't have any points in it. Some of these can get pretty damn harsh, and for that reason, it's a good idea to put at least a few points into skills you expect to use in game, even a little bit. I see this far too often, where new players just take 4 combat skills and no life or information skills. If you ask your GM, they should tell you at least 5 skills they recommend you to take in their game beyond just hitting people well. Back to the skill itself, some skills may have prerequisites tied to them, either in the form of an advantage or another skill. These are typically non-negotiable. Sometimes you may see a cross marked next to a skill. That means that it branches out into multiple specializations that you must choose. The skill list is long, so the best way to look at it is just by skimming it over and taking a closer look at the specializations you want to focus on. Eventually, you'll have a character with a unique set of trades to be used in-game. We're going to leave it off at here for now. To be honest, if you've already made it this far without the book, then what harm could it do to read the rest of it on your own? You've pretty much gotten through the more dense part. You guys deserve a full in-depth video on GURPS' combat, so expect that one to come next. You're not going to wait nearly as long as you've waited for this one, though. If this is your first introduction to the system, you deserve major props for giving this game a chance. I guarantee you all of this prep is worth it to see your unique vision through. And if this is a video your friend sent you to desperately get you into the system, come on, just do one session. So what's next for me? I'm going to be doing the second part of my live stream ranking all of the skills of GURPS, where I'll be answering questions and finally finishing the gargantuan list. After that, I'll resume working on the second part. I was originally intending for it to be all one video, but I didn't want to risk half-assing the second half and not giving you guys a full analysis. You can expect more of the usual rules and combat exhibit shorts as well. If you're looking for some fan outlets to voice rules, questions, or find games, there's a semi-official GURPS Discord with many veterans and even writers involved, as well as a Reddit board for any content you want to post and share. I've also got my own Discord where you can get updates on my uploads. I also just want to give some appreciation for all of the content creators out there still covering GURPS, especially those abroad. If you search GURPS by new, there's actually a good chance it's going to be in Russian or Portuguese rather than English. I love the system, almost too much, but it means the world to me that there's people willing to watch along and learn. And if you've made it this far dealing with my voice, why not subscribe if you haven't already? Alright guys, that's going to be all. Thanks for watching, and stay GURPing.